You will take a songbook from 93, the first Psalms, page 93, the 13th, and the song service. Brother William McConnell will prayer, and Brother Malcolm Bob close in prayer. The announcement we read the second word this morning, reminder to keep Lulu Hall and her family in your prayers. And also, this being today, we did agree that we would send some help to help with their funeral arrangements for Willie. So keep them in your thoughts and prayers this week, please. Upcoming events is 24th, there are Justice Services Fellowship Meal. And internalization verse will be Romans 12, 1 and 2. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will be. Again, thank you all for being here.
Christ for the world we sing, the world to Christ we bring, let loving to the power and them that more love tainted overboard, sick and sorrowful, whom Christ does give. Christ for the world sing. The world to Christ we bring with joyful song. The newborn souls today reclaim from error's ways, gives life and hope and praise to Christ alone. Before we go to God and girls meet, we'll sing number 71. 71. Blessed Assurance. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine, heir of salvation, purchase of God, born of His Spirit, washed in His blood. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Perfect submission, perfect delight, visions of rapture have burst on my side. Angels descending, bring from above, echoes of mercy, whispers of love. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Perfect submission, all is at rest. I in my Savior am happy and blessed, watching and waiting, looking above, filled with His goodness, lost in His love. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Father, we're grateful for this day. We're grateful for every soul that's with us. We're grateful for the freedom that we have, the building that we have, and the comfort of that. Most of all, we're grateful that we have a Savior who died for us. Help us this night to think about Him seriously, renew and rekindle His life in our life if need be, to keep us on the way up. Help us to forgive all of our sins. Help us to all our enemies. Please forgive us all our sins. We pray in Jesus' name. And amen. next song will be number 53, 5 at Calvary. Years I spent in vanity and pride, caring not my Lord was crucified, knowing not it was for me He died on Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free. Pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burden soul found liberty at Calvary. By God's word at last my sin I learned. Then I trembled at the law I spurned, till my guilty soul in full returned to Calvary. Mercy that was great and grace was free. Pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burden soul found liberty at Calvary. Now I give to Jesus everything. Now I gladly owe Him as my King. Now my raptured soul can only sing of Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free. Pardon there was multiplied to me. Then my burden soul found liberty at Calvary. Oh, the love and true salvation's plan. Oh, the grace that brought it down to man. Oh, the mighty goal that God dispatched at Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free. Pardon there was multiplied to me. Then my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. Do at this time mark 389. 389. We'll sing that after the extension of our Lord's invitation. After you have that marked, if you would, turn over to 717. Victory in Jesus, 717. Like stand as we sing this song, you may. I heard an old story, how a Savior came from glory, how He gave His life on Calvary to save a wretch like me. I heard about His groaning, of His precious blood atoning. Then I repented of my sins and won the victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior, forever. He sought me and bought me with His redeeming
to victory beneath the cleansing flood. I've heard about His healing, of His cleansing power revealing, how He made the lame to walk again, and caused the blind to see. And then I cried, dear Jesus, come and heal my broken spirit. I then obeyed His last command and gained the victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior, forever. He sought me and bought me with His redeeming blood. He loved me and I knew Him, and all the love is to Him. He pushed me to victory beneath the cleansing flood. I heard about a mansion He has built for me in glory. And I heard about the streets of gold beyond the crystal sea, about the angels singing and the old redemption story. And some sweet day I'll sing of them the song of victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior, forever. He sought me and bought me with His redeeming blood. He loved me and I knew Him, and all my love is to Him. He pushed me to victory beneath the cleansing flood.
Okay, I thought there was something wrong already. I want to welcome you tonight. Certainly grateful for your presence. Appreciate so much for being here, for your interest in things that are eternal in nature, and taking care of your spiritual needs, and to those things that will help us get to heaven. And I appreciate so much your support of the work that's going on here. I hope that as we go through the lesson tonight, that you will gain something from it that will help you in your studies of God's Word and your desire to put those things into your own life. As we've been studying throughout the weeks, the previous weeks, and for some time now, we're going to continue our study of the Old Testament book. We're down in the book of Nehemiah, as you can tell from the slide, and we're going to go through the book of Nehemiah briefly, look at some things along the way about the book of Nehemiah. And I appreciate your patience and understanding with me. You all know that I have not got a college degree as far as teaching or preaching, and that I have not been educated in the line of slides and PowerPoint presentations. So y'all are getting the privilege and the opportunity as you learn from God's Word to see somebody hopefully grow in experience and expertise in this field. And I plan to keep on using this thing because I believe that it's beneficial for me as a presenter and as for you as an audience and learners to have the ability to hear things that are said, but also to see it and draw some information from it as well. So we're going to try to continue this practice, and I appreciate so much your bearing with me as we go through this, because I think that it will be beneficial for us to do it this way. The book of Nehemiah.
16th book in the Old Testament. We're almost halfway through our study of the books of the Old Testament. Nehemiah. What is it about the book of Nehemiah that we can learn or know about? The first thing that I think that we can look at is something that we've looked along the way as far as the information about the book itself. There's 13 chapters in the book of Nehemiah. There's 406 verses, and there's 10,480 words in the book of Nehemiah in the King James Version of the Bible. That's for your benefit. There won't be a test, I told you, but something that you might know, you might throw out in your, I don't know where you'd be able to use it other than around us Christians, but that's okay. Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah means whom Jehovah hath comforted. We'll look at that in a little bit of detail as we get a little bit further down into the book. Covers a time period from 445 BC to about 418 BC. And actually, if you look at the book of Nehemiah, it is the last book in the historical record of the Jews. This is the last accounting of the Hebrew nation as we know it in the Old Testament canon or in the Old Testament books. It runs along the same line as the book of Malachi. They both were written about the same time. And actually, in one of the commentaries that I read, it says that the last verse in chapter 13, more than likely, was probably the last verse written in the Old Testament canon. The last word that came from God, because you have a little over a 400-year period of time where God did not communicate with God's people or in a written form or by prophecy before the beginning of the New Testament. So we're looking at in this book probably the last written words of God or from God to His chosen people and in an inspired way before the coming of Christ in the beginning of Matthew. And also, it is in relationship to the book of Ezra. Who wrote the book of Nehemiah? Some people say that Ezra was the writer of Nehemiah, but more than likely Nehemiah was written by Nehemiah himself. There are several passages of Scripture where it is used the first person pronoun in it. He talks about it from the standpoint of as he was talking about himself. So more than likely the book of Nehemiah was written by Nehemiah himself. But some of the books, historical logs and things that are written about the people was not necessarily Nehemiah, but were taken from the records of those people that had come back into Jerusalem from the Babylonian captivity. But Ezra and Nehemiah and also 1st and 2nd Chronicles were written, and at one time they were a book together. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah were looked at from the same standpoint because they dealt with the same details in getting the children of Israel into captivity as the people of Judah, those people of God that were in Judah and the southern kingdom, into captivity, then through captivity, then out of captivity and back to Jerusalem. So they're all connected, even though they're individual books. And probably Ezra wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and Ezra and Nehemiah wrote the book of Nehemiah. It's kind of what we're looking at historical example. Inspiration in the book of Nehemiah. We don't have any direct miracles from God that we can attribute to the book of Nehemiah. We do see in Nehemiah God communicating with Nehemiah. Nehemiah often prayers to God, and God responding and protecting providentially along the way, but we don't have any direct miracles. And there's not any real accounting of the book of Nehemiah in the New Testament that we can say, well, here, this is what happened in Nehemiah, and this is how it was referred to in the New Testament. But because of the connection to Ezra, we have the connection with inspiration in Nehemiah, and we see Ezra and Nehemiah working together in the process of restoring the people of Israel in Jerusalem. And it said there in Nehemiah 8, verse 9, Nehemiah, which is of Tirshatha, and Ezra the priest, the scribe, and the Levites that taught the people, said unto all the people, this day is a holy day unto the Lord your God, mourn not, nor weep, for all the people wept when they heard the words of the law. And so we see there Nehemiah working alongside with Ezra in the restoration of God's people in Jerusalem. The purpose of Nehemiah. The reason that Nehemiah was written, we look very closely at Ezra and we can see that it was a book about the restoration of the people of Israel to the city of Jerusalem and also the spiritual restoration of them. Nehemiah comes on the scene about 445 BC, after Ezra had been there for a while, to restore the actual city walls of Jerusalem. And in that process, we see the people being despondent, or not being able to work together, or not getting along. And so we see that the work was not going as planned as it had begun with Zerubbabel, and then going into Ezra, and now coming down to Nehemiah. And so the book of Nehemiah, more specifically, is a restoration of the civil government of Jerusalem, also the restoration of the walls, so that the people of Israel could do what they were supposed to do in worship to God and in service to God. So it was a book that was written to strengthen the hearts of God's people and show that great things could be done and accomplished in spite of the great difficulties that are involved in trying to do what God has to do. So as we've looked at throughout the books of the Old Testament, Nehemiah also is a book that shows for us in type what happens within the church today. And so as we look at the book of Nehemiah, we can see it and account for it, how it applies to us as we strive to build up the church, which is the Jerusalem of today. Simple outline of the book of Nehemiah. Roman numeral number 1 involves chapters 1 and part of chapters 2, and it is Nehemiah's desire toward restoring Jerusalem. Specifically, the walls of Jerusalem was the work that Nehemiah went about to reestablish. Secondly, it's the procedures and obstacles in the rebuilding of that wall. It goes through in details and talks about how they went about to do the work and what stood in their way of accomplishing the work. Roman numeral number 3 was Ezra and Nehemiah working together in the restoration of the city of Jerusalem and also in the lives of the people of the city of Jerusalem. And then Roman numeral number 4 would be Nehemiah's call to holiness for those people. Because as you look at the book of Nehemiah, it is very closely involved with the book of Ezra. And just as Ezra had to deal with those people and the spiritual failings that they had in the intermarrying and the things that they were doing that were leading them down the same path that had caused God to destroy them or to lead them off into captivity, Nehemiah saw that and was a part of that same restoration that Ezra was a part of, as we look at in Ezra. So that's Nehemiah's call for those people in Roman numeral 4. It's his call for them to be a holy people set aside for God. And we can see that in a type for us as well, is that we have to be pure and holy in order for God to be able to work through us as well. Lessons to be learned are brought to you by the letter D. I was trying to think what a television program, kids program, Sesame Street. That's right. I'm not talking to y'all as if y'all were kids on Sesame Street. I'm just trying to use the letter D as a way of remembering some of the things that are lessons that are being taught. And I didn't think about that when I started going that route, but it did approach me when I said brought to you by the letter D. I said, where have I seen that before? All right, so that's what it is. But the letter D, we're going to think about the letter D is the lessons that we can learn from Nehemiah. The first lesson that we can learn from the book of Nehemiah is the letter D for distraught. Distraught. We know what it means to distraught. Distraught. We see something, we're down and out. We want to look at, if you have your Bibles, turn to Nehemiah chapter 1, and we're going to look at verses 3 and 4, thinking about the idea or the term distraught. It says in Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 3, and they said unto me, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. And it came to pass when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept, and mourned certain days and fasted, and prayed before the God of heaven. Here we have the situation where Nehemiah, who is the cupbearer for the king, Artaxerxes, is doing his job, and his brother and some of the brethren that are familiar with what's going on in Jerusalem with the restoration of the city come to him and tell him that what is going on there is a terrible, terrible situation. That the people are in a bad state and nothing is being done, and it looks horrible. And what we see with Nehemiah here is his reaction to hearing what's going on with God's people on this particular time and situation. And the word distraught comes to mind here. He was brought very low and very saddened because of the situation there. And when we think about that, I want us to step back and think about how this applies to you and I as far as what makes us sad in life? What brings us down? Or what discourages or disheartens us in our lives? Is it not getting our way or not getting what we want? Is it the fact that things are not happening in the way that we want them to happen? What makes us sad? For this man, he looked and saw God's chosen people. The city of God, Jerusalem, is known throughout as the royal city of God's choosing. And it's in complete disrepair. And the people there are being abused and put down, and they're in a sorry, sad state. And it makes him very sad. What was going on with those people? If we take that and apply it to ourselves, what makes us sad? Is what going on in the Church of Christ today make us sad in any form or fashion? Are we disheartened by the fact that the church is going down rather than up? Are we disheartened by the fact that we see people we love and care about who were members of the Church of Christ who are no longer members of the Church of Christ, faithful members of the Church of Christ? What makes us sad? For Nehemiah, it was the fact that God's chosen people were in a bad state. That brought him very low. I hope that as we think about that we will think about what makes us sad, and hope that as we think about the church and all the lost souls around us, that it brings us in despair to some degree and motivates us to want to do something about it, or do what we can about it. It affected him that way. We see in Nehemiah 2 and verse 2, Wherefore the king said unto me, Why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick? There is nothing else but sorrow of heart. Then I was very sore afraid. Nehemiah was the kind of man that as people looked at him, as the king, as his boss looked at him, basically you want to say, he was a very light-hearted person, a very happy person for the most part. And when he became distraught about that situation, it was evidenced in those people around him, especially the king. Is there any time that people can say, I know that their person is down and out? I think that's the case. People can tell when we have bad moments in our lives and when we're sad for some reason. But are we in a state about the church where people can see that we're not very happy about the situation and something needs to be done about it? I hope that that we among ourselves can see that there is a concern on our hearts. We need that people want to be aware of what's going on in our lives, and especially within the church. The second thing, lesson that we can learn from Nehemiah tonight is that of daring. Daring. The D of daring. You can find that in Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 3. Nehemiah 2 and verse 3 says, And said unto the king, Let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad, when the cities of the place of my fathers and sepulchres lie in waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire? Nehemiah was in a position where he was going to the king, or he was in the surrounding of the king, and the king didn't want people who were down in the mountain around him possibly. We don't want to be around people who are downhearted and always talking down or bad. And so the king looks over here and he says, you're down. What's going on? And so, and you look up at verse 2 and it says, And I was sore afraid. He knew that this could affect his job. This could affect his life even if, he didn't set the right attitude towards the king. And so he had to stand up at that point and give an account for why he felt the way that he felt. We all have to give an account for how we feel in our lives, for good or for bad. And sometimes it's going to cost us for how we feel and how we act around people. But he was daring. He went ahead and said, Here's the problem with my life. I'm upset because things are not going well religiously or spiritually, and I'm aware of it, and something needs to be done about it. He took a chance by saying this to the king. And so he was a daring in that respect. We know daring people. There are people who are willing to take a chance. My wife gives me a hard time. We used to go down the river, and she called me a very daring person. We go, there was a little cliff about 50 feet up in there, and as we were going down in the canoe, you could see these people jumping off in the water. And so I said, I'm going to jump off in the water like this. No. And she thought that was daring. Some people it might be daring, but that's not really that big of a dare. Well, we have to stand up for the truth and stand up to make things right. Then that's daring in respect. because we are talking about our soul's eternal destiny. It's not some simple thing like jumping out of a plane or jumping off a cliff or, that sort of thing. It's not the kind of daring that we're talking about. We're talking about being daring when it comes to the spiritual truth in our spiritual lives. That's where Nehemiah was. He was trying to stand up for what was needing to be done in respect to God. It says in 6:11, this is what Nehemiah said, and said, should such a man as I flee, who is there that, being as I am, will go into the temple and save his life? I will not go in. In this particular situation, there had been a group of people who were trying to prevent Nehemiah, after he'd gone to Jerusalem, from accomplishing what he was sent out to do. And what they had intended to do, or what they had told him they were going to do, is they were going to make up a lie that he was planning a rebellion against the king and send that to the king. And they sent someone in there to intimidate him and try to get him to go and hide in the temple and act like, he wasn't really trying to do that. And this is the response that he made. He said, I'm in a position where I have to set the right example for other people. I'm not going to go in there and hide and act like I'm afraid of what they're saying about me. They're telling an untruth. They're not presenting the truth, and I'm going to stand up to it. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about daring. Are we willing to stand up to those who would stand against us in the fight for Christ and the church of Christ? Third D, in lessons that we can learn from the book of Nehemiah, is that of disruption. Disruption. That's found in Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. If you want to turn there and look, we'll read from Nehemiah chapter 4 and think about the idea of disruption. In Nehemiah chapter 4, it says, beginning verse 1, but it came to pass that when Sanballat heard that we builded the wall, he was wroth and took great indignation and mocked the Jews. And he spake before his brethren and the army of Samaria, and he said, what do these feeble Jews? Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones of the heaps of the rubbish which are burned? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was by him, and he said, even that which they build, if a fox go up, he shall even break down their stone wall. These men were adamantly against what Nehemiah was trying to do. They wanted to disrupt them in their process of rebuilding the wall and restoring the beauty and the grandeur of Jerusalem. They were going to do everything. And here they lay in wait, and they're right there giving insults to what they're trying to do. When we think about what's going on here, we think about the Jerusalem of today being the Church of Christ. When we try to do the things to stand up for the Church of Christ and for the truth of the gospel, people are going to put us down. We talked about this not too long ago. The idea of the question, so you think that y'all in the Church of Christ are the only ones going to heaven. That's an insult given towards us or directed towards us so that, we should pull back and think, well, we shouldn't be talking that way. We shouldn't say that. We shouldn't stand for that. That's the same idea as what was happening here in Nehemiah. You foolish person, what are you trying to do? You know you're not going to be successful in this. Even if you build a wall up, as small as a fox jumps on it, it's going to fall down. Satan comes out in many ways to try to stop us from accomplishing what God wants us to do. He's trying to disrupt us in any way that he can. And this is just one way, the insult. There are other examples in the book of Nehemiah of how they went about to do it. If they didn't work, they went to the second plan, which was in that they said, come down to the plain of Ono and let's meet together. And let's discuss this situation. We'll make a compromise and we'll work it out. That was just another way. You could go through it. Then they made up the story or the lie that they were going to tell about it. Any way that the devil can try to disrupt or disrupt the work of the church, he's going to do it. He's going to find a way to get me and you keep from working together to build the church. Nehemiah is a perfect example of how Satan operates to try to stop us in our efforts to do the right thing with God. Nehemiah 2 verse 19 says, but when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant of the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian heard it, they laughed us to scorn and despised us and said, what is this thing that you do? Will you rebel against the king? People are going to talk down to you, and they're going to talk down to me, and they're going to talk bad about the church. But we need not pay any attention to that, because we're doing the work of God, and we can't be held back because we've made up our minds that we're going to accomplish what God has set out for us to do. And nothing's going to stand in our way. Fourth, or the fifth D in the D's of the book of Nehemiah is that of determined. In the face of all that they had coming at them and the work that they've done, we need to look at Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 6, where it says, "So built we the wall, and all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof, for the people had a mind to work." As we think about the day of destruction and what all is being done to try to distract us from what the work it is that we need to be doing, we need to be determined that we're not going to let it get to us. We need to close our mind and our eyes and our hearts to those things that will stand in the way of us having a mind to go and do what God would have us to do. These people saw an important work, and they determined within their hearts and minds that they were going to accomplish it no matter what was done to try to stop it. Is that the mindset that we have? Do we have the mindset that we're going to accomplish what God wants us to accomplish as a group of God's people? Do we have a small part in the wall? If you go back and you look at Nehemiah chapter 2, there in that chapter, it gives a listing and it gives how they rebuilt the wall. And it says one family and one group built this section. And right next to them, there was a family and a group, and they built this section. And right next to them, there was a family and a group in this section, and they built that wall. And it went all the way around so that they were building it. Everybody had a part to do, and everybody was doing that part, and everybody was working together. And they made it. Another thing was that when the enemy determined that they were going to, if they couldn't talk them out of it, if they couldn't compromise the work, if they couldn't intimidate them, then they were going to attack them. And there were personal attacks, or an army set up and was going to attack them. And so Nehemiah, what does he do? He sits and he says, half the people will have a weapon and half the people will have tools. We'll have some ready to fight and some that are working, and we're going to continue to work. We're determined to do it. And sometimes that's the way it is. Sometimes we have to fight for the truth. Sometimes we have to be working to spread the gospel. There are different things that we have to be doing to accomplish what we have to do. Do we have the determination to do every aspect of what is called on us to do in order to accomplish what we need to do? They had a mind to work. They were determined to accomplish. In Nehemiah 4, verse 23, it says, "So neither I, nor my brethren, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard which followed thee, none of us put off our clothes, saving that everyone put them on for washing." This job, or accomplishing this job, finishing this job, was so important to them that they weren't going to be distracted by whatever. And and we'll see how long it took them to accomplish this job, but it was day after day after day after day that they were wearing the same clothes. They didn't stop. They were determined to do it, and that indicates to me what our mindset should be. What's getting in the way of me and you as far as accomplishing things for God? We live in a land of distractions, for sure. We have seasons for this and seasons for that and seasons for that and days for this and days for that. We have special occasions. There are so many different distractions in the American society when it comes to doing the work of God that, building the wall is a lot of times very low down on the list when we think about the church. And then when we think about the D's of the book of Nehemiah, the final D that we have is that of done. Nehemiah 6 and verse 15 says, and this is probably one of the most noted passages of Scripture that people quote or sermons come from. It says in Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse number 15, "So the wall was finished in the 25th day in the month of Elul in 52 days." It took them 52 days to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. The people had a mind to work, and so it was done very quickly. And so we can accomplish many things if we will put our mind to it and then work to accomplish those things. Nehemiah 13 and 31 says, "And for the wood offering at the times appointed, and for the first fruits, remember me, O my God, for good." This is the last thing that is talked about. This is actually the last verse in the book of Nehemiah. And this is Nehemiah appealing to God at his last breath. Not at his death, but the last recorded words by inspiration. And he says, "God, you see what I've done." And this is more than just the building of the walls of Jerusalem. he went through and he did a lot of other things that are accounted for in the book of Nehemiah. And he appeals to God to remember the things that he had done. So we think about Nehemiah and the things that are involved in this book. As we look at our own lives, can we, in our final breaths or in our final thoughts, offer to God this petition or prayer that He will remember us for the good that we've accomplished? Or can we not have that appeal to God because we haven't set our minds to do it and accomplished anything for God? When we think about Nehemiah and the story that it tells for us as workers for God, we need to look at our lives and see what we've accomplished for God. And if our list is very short and incomplete, then we can make up our minds to accomplish what God would have us to do. But we can only accomplish things for God if we're a child of God. If we're a member of the family of God, just like these Jews were. And we looked at that in Ezra, and it's also in Nehemiah, the fact that there are only privileged people who can have the reward of working for God. And that's those people who are His children. You become a child of God by being obedient to the plan of salvation and being baptized, being born again into the family of God. John 3:3-5. So if you're not a Christian, you can appeal to God to remember the works that you've done because you've not done any works for God because you're not a child of God. And as children of God, as Christians, we need to evaluate ourselves on a regular basis. What have we accomplished? Are we working in the field? Are we building the walls of Jerusalem today, the Church of Christ? If we're not, then we need to make adjustments in our lives about that as well and get to work. God will forgive us for our laziness or indifference or whatever it may be, but we have to be working. Now, I was thinking about work and how in our society we look at people and we think about people who are on welfare. We think about how these people there are people who can't work. I'll give you that. But there are a lot of people who are on welfare who are just getting a check so that they don't have to work and so that they can take life easy. And you know what we think about those kind of people? We don't like those people. We despise those people who take money, who could be working and earning a living and providing and adding to society. But there are people who are in the Church of Christ who think that they're going to get a check and reward at the end of this life, and they're not applying themselves to the work of the Lord, thinking that things are going to be okay at that point. And just as much as we dislike the idea of people taking a welfare check to avoid work, God is not going to reward those people who are not working in the kingdom. The same principle applies today. And so that sounds harsh, but that's the reality. We have to be working. So if we're not working in the kingdom, let's make the change that needs to be made and start applying ourselves to the best of our ability so that we can accomplish the things that God has given us to do and that we can be rewarded in that final day. And so the invitation is here for you and for I that if we need to make changes, we can and be rewarded by God in that last and final day. And so I appeal to you, if you need to make a change in your life, do it tonight while together we stand and while we sing.
Would you live for Jesus and be always doing good? Would you hold with Him in the name of love? Would you have His and be all your Lord? And Him have His way with Thee. His love can make you what you want to be. His love can cleanse your heart and make you free. His love can fill your soul and you will see what's best. For Him to have His way place of constant rest. Would you prove him true, each providential test? Would you in his service labor always at your best? Let him have his way with thee. His life can make you what you ought to be. His blood can cleanse your heart and make you free. His love can fill your soul, and you will see what's best. For him to have his way with thee. You may remain standing. Is there anyone here that needs to take the Lord's Supper at this time? All right. Thank you all for being here. Do we have any final announcements that we need to make before we dismiss? All right then. Hope you can be back with us on Wednesday evening for our midweek Bible study at 7 p.m. Our final song will be 860. 860. We'll sing this song and then we'll have our closing prayer. 860. He is my everything. He is my all. He is my everything, both great and small. He gave his life for me, made everything new. He is my everything. Now how about you? Some folks may ask me, some folks may say, who is this Jesus you talk about every day? He is my Savior, He set me free. Now listen while I tell you what He means to me. He is my everything. He is my all. He is my everything, both great and small. He gave his life for me, made everything new. He is my everything. Now how about you? Let's pray.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this wonderful day that you've given us, for this wonderful opportunity to do this here, Lord, to you. We're so thankful for this church family and everything that you've blessed us. Father, we ask to be with those that we should see, and those that are in need, we bless them, and comfort them. Lord, we ask to keep us safe until the next appointed time. Please forgive us of our many sins. In God's name we pray.
Thank you.